All right, welcome back, everybody. We're moving on now to lecture 3.3. We're going to look at the question of compulsory voting in the paper by Lisa Hill. And before we get going, I just wanted to inform you that if you found this issue especially interesting, there is a book written by Lisa Hill and also Jason Brennan, and it basically lays out in detail the case for compulsory voting and the case against it, with Hill representing the pro-compulsory voting side and Brennan representing the against compulsory voting side of the debate. So if you thought this was a cool issue and you want to learn more, I encourage you to take a look at that book. Okay, so let's start by reviewing a few facts about the history of Australia's voting system. So in the 1919 elections, roughly 71% of registered Australian voters turned out to vote. And by the time of the 1922 election, this number plummeted to just below 60%. I think it was something in the range of 59.6% or something. So this was a rather dramatic drop from the previous cycle. And there's still some uncertainty about exactly why this occurred. Some people think it was because of World War II, or sorry, World War One. So World War One had just ended. Nowadays, it's a little bit hard not to think about the fact that there was a global pandemic happening then as well. But, Australia had its worst wave of the Spanish flu in 1919. So it's not clear that that could explain it. And then there were also some changes to Australia's voting system itself between 1919 and 1922. So some people think maybe that had something to do with the drop in voter participation. But whatever the cause, this was a problem, and it got politicians worrying about the state of voting in Australia. So the government decided to make voting mandatory. In 1924, they passed legislation making it mandatory, and indeed in 1925, the percentage of participating voters increased to 91%. So the change in legislation had a huge effect. And if you are curious sort of to see now, if you go onto the web pages by the Electoral Commission in Australia, you'll see all the rules associated with this compulsory system. And now basically the incentives are not extremely dramatic. So if you don't vote, you're going to get notified by the Electoral Commission that you have failed to fulfill this obligation. And at that point, you'll have three choices. Either you can explain why that you did in fact vote. So maybe there was a mistake. That's the first thing here. You could give what they call a valid and sufficient reason for not voting, and then that way you could be excused, or you can pay a fine of $20. So as you can see, the penalties for not voting are not drastic, but there are some consequences. Okay, so this is the system that Australia has. And Hill, who lives and works in Australia, is familiar with the system and has come to the conclusion that it's a good system. And so she wants to make the case for the reasonableness of a compulsory system of voting. And in particular, she thinks that one of the main benefits of a system like this is that it makes voting more rational for individuals. So that you can see the connection now to the paper by Guerrero that we read for Tuesday. This is a way of looking at not the rationality necessarily of voting for an individual, though she has things to say about that, but she's interested in what would it take for a voting system to be rational, where that means it makes voting rational for individuals. And in addition to this, Hill wants to show us that a compulsory voting system helps us to realize some important values of liberal democracy. And I said that Hill lives in Australia, so that's probably a partial reason for why she's taking the Australian case as her test case. But even more importantly, the Australian case is a good test case because it's a well-administered compulsory voting system. There are a lot of compulsory voting systems actually in the world, but not all of them are very well administered. And the thought is that it wouldn't make sense to look at a poorly managed system if our goal is to determine whether a compulsory voting system, when it's done right, can be reasonable. So this is the motivation for the Australian case as our test case. So to set the stage a little bit, let's talk about a standard argument against compulsory voting. Here's a line of thinking one might endorse. Well, you shouldn't compel somebody to do something that they wouldn't otherwise want to do or find convenient to do or see as rational to do. Compelling people to do these kinds of things is improper or wrong. Um, and so this is a broadly libertarian line of thinking that says it's a violation of our liberty to compel us to vote. Now, Hill is not going to deny in this paper that choice and freedom are important political values. But she's going to argue that unless you think these values trump all other liberal values and liberal democratic values, there's a strong case for compulsory voting. So connected to this, it's also important to note that Hill isn't going to deny that there is some harm associated with compelling people to vote. She's not denying that. Instead, she's saying that the harm of restricting freedom to abstain from voting is outweighed by the benefits that flow from a compulsory system. So she's not going to deny that it counts against the system of compulsory voting, that it restricts people's freedom. But she's saying that this mark against it is outweighed by the good things that follow from a compulsory system. Okay, step two of the setup here is that we need to get clear on what happens when voting is voluntary. So as you've seen, this leads to a number of problems in Hill's view. The sort of general description of the problem is that when not everybody votes, we don't see a proportionate reduction in voting among all different types of people. Instead, we see that certain groups of people tend to drop out of voting participation in disproportionate numbers. We see this in the United States for sure. So you can imagine why. People who are homeless and have difficulty registering would tend to drop out in disproportionate numbers. People who can't easily get time off of work would also tend to drop out in disproportionate numbers. People who have disabilities that make mobility difficult would also be inclined to vote less. And in general, people who need to preserve scarce resources are going to be the kinds of people for whom voting participation drops off when voting is voluntary. And what this means overall is that voluntary systems tend to be unrepresentative. So certain interests are represented more than other interests in the voting process. And by the way, representativeness is one of the values that Hill thinks we're trying to preserve in government. So that was a problem, that representativeness is decreased when voting is voluntary. But you might still want to push back and say, it seems like there's some value still in allowing people to abstain, perhaps value even beyond the value of freedom of choice. So for instance, some people have said that abstaining is the way in which we express tacit consent to the government. So abstaining voters, when they abstain and don't vote, they're communicating that they're happy with how things are going. And so the idea is that we need this option in order to express tacit consent. But Hill notices that this isn't a great argument, really. So part of the problem is that people abstain from voting for many different reasons. Homelessness, we've already talked about this. Illness, demoralization. If you feel like you don't have any political efficacy, you may not vote. And so on, many other things that she didn't talk about as well as other things that she did talk about. But what does this mean? This means that abstention doesn't actually have much communicative or expressive value. From the fact that people abstain, you can't at all infer that they're happy with how things are going. In fact, there's evidence that abstainers tend to be less happy with government than people who vote. So the argument that allowing people to abstain is important because it allows them an expressive mode of tacit consent, giving consent that they're happy with the way things are going, that argument doesn't hold water. So let's look at the case for compulsory voting now. In general, Hill is asking us to see voting as a problem of collective action. And her point is that a voluntary system makes voting less rational for the individual in the short term, even though voting is irrational in the long term. Not voting is irrational in the long term. I thought something was wrong there. Sorry. A voluntary system makes voting less rational for the individual in the short term, even though not voting is irrational in the long term. So she asks us to consider an example to show why this is the case. So suppose you're a member of a group that typically doesn't have good voter turnout. Hill says, imagine you're a Black woman in a low income bracket. You might decide not to vote, and in fact, you might be behaving rationally in the sense that you know that most other people like you won't vote, which means that your vote really won't help you make sure that your interest group is represented. But on the other hand, there's also irrationality going on here in the sense that this kind of thinking is what leads to so many people like you not voting. And the result of this is that the population who needs protection the most ends up abstaining. So clearly, it's not good for your long term interest. The solution, according to Hill, is to adopt a compulsory voting system. So when voting is compulsory, one of the things you get is confidence and knowledge that others in your interest groups will also vote because it's compulsory. But this isn't it. There's more. A system of compulsory voting, at least when it's well administered, also is going to reduce the opportunity costs of voting. And the reason for this is that the state, when they compel people to vote, also need to step in to help bear some of the burdens of making voting feasible for people. So in the paper, you'll see that Hill lists a number of different things that the Australian government does in order to make voting convenient and feasible for the populace. This is what she means when she says that when the state is compelling people to participate in the voting process, they end up also having to reduce the opportunity costs of voting. And additionally, a compulsory system promotes the liberal democratic value of equal political opportunity. The idea here is that it's a good thing for people to have equal opportunities to participate in the political system. Compulsory voting facilitates this. So the analogy here you might make with a system of compulsory education. We think a system of compulsory education is good because it secures the value of equal opportunity in education. And it's worth noting here that all of this stuff together gives us both consequentialist and non-consequentialist rationales for a system of compulsory voting. So what do we mean by that? We mean that some of these arguments for compulsory voting, such as that it has as an outcome that people have more information about who else is voting, and they know that there are other people in their interest groups will also vote. That's a consequence of a compulsory system. It's a good consequence. Similarly, a consequence of a compulsory system is that the government needs to step in and reduce the opportunity costs of voting. So those are two kind of consequentialist lines of argument. But then there's also a non-consequentialist rationale, which is that independently of those other good consequences, it's good to realize the value of equal political opportunity. So independently of any of those first two consequentialist rationales, realize the democratic value of equal political opportunity is an additional non-consequentialist argument for a compulsory voting system. There are a few important things to note here, though. One very important idea is that this ideal of equal political opportunity doesn't, on Hill's view, justify compelling people to actually mark a ballot. Instead, it justifies compelling people to register to vote and show up at the polling place, or if they can't physically show up, to complete some other kind of attendance check. In fact, Hill even thinks that it's a further benefit of compulsory voting that the ways in which people actually refuse to register support for candidates at the polls are far more communicative, meaning they give better information than mere abstention does. So let me just show you a few examples of this. Um, these are some ways in which people fulfill their obligation to show up at the polls and register participation without actually indicating support for anyone in particular. Um, this is an old-ish ballot. The Australian Sex Party is now called, I think, the Victoria Reason or something like that, some other name. The history of that party, the name is a little bit um, misleading in some ways. Um, Here we have a voter who turned their ballot into a falafel order, basically. This actually doesn't seem to have much expressive value, but it may have more expressive value than abstention in the sense that you know that this voter is trying to make light of things, and that communicates something. Here we have a voter who, instead of filling out the ballot properly, said, "Bring back Malcolm Turnbull, you Muppets." Um, these are clearly communicative ways of filling out a ballot, which do not register support for a particular candidate. And so Hill notes that you would need a lot of resources to actually keep track of all this kind of information. But in principle, you could get a lot of information about the ways in which people are not content by looking at the ways in which they spoil their ballots, essentially. Okay, so let's return to the rationality question. So one of the things that Hill says that I think was helpful and interesting is that asking whether it's rational for an individual to vote in a voluntary system is a little like asking whether it would be rational for me to pay taxes if taxes were voluntary. There does seem to be something strange about that. If paying taxes were voluntary, these sorts of prisoner's dilemma problems and free riding problems just would arise. And this would create irrationalities in the system, regardless of what I do. So the idea is that just like a voluntary taxation system really couldn't work properly and would generate irrationalities, so too, a voluntary voting system really doesn't work properly. And a compulsory system is what's needed to generate a system that really works properly and that makes voting rational for individuals. And the overall lesson here then is that we need to focus on what would make a voting system rational. Here's what Hill says about this at some point. She says, compelling people to vote is thus reasonable to the extent that state coercion is acceptable in resolving problems of coordination in order to improve or generate system utility. Sorry. So I think this is a helpful idea. There is something to the idea that we need to think about what would it mean for a voting system to be rational? And part of what that's asking is what would a system look like that makes voting rational for individuals? Okay, now we're getting very near the end, but I do want to clarify something. So Hill makes a clarification about her view that you might have found confusing initially. So she says, what I'm saying is that we have an obligation to vote, but this is not the same as saying that we have a duty to vote. And in this course so far, we've used these terms obligation and duty interchangeably. So you might have thought, what does she mean by this? Now, of course, she clarifies this, so let me just try to give a gloss on how she understands these terms. On her view, or as she's stipulating she's going to use these terms in the paper, obligations are things that require us to protect the conditions that enable other people to protect their own interest and to promote their own flourishing. In contrast, duties are things that require us to take a positive interest in others' well-being. So not just to protect the conditions that allow them to pursue their own well-being and flourishing, but actually to take a positive interest in promoting others' well-being and flourishing, rather than just protecting the conditions that let them do that for themselves. So in saying that we have an obligation but not a duty to vote, what Hill wants to say is that we're required to protect people's ability to vote. Hill's saying that we're required to protect people's ability to vote for whom they think will best serve their interests, but we're not required or even permitted to make people vote for the candidates or parties who actually are most likely to protect their interests. So you can't make people vote for the particular people that are actually best for them, but we do have a requirement to protect people's ability to choose for themselves who's going to serve their interests. And connected to this whole thing is the idea that the obligation to vote is an obligation we owe to other citizens. So the reason when we have an obligation, that's something we owe to other people, and the content of it is to protect the conditions that allow them to flourish. So this is something owed between citizens. And in saying, oops, sorry, that made the text hidden. In saying that the compulsory voting pertains to an obligation but not a duty, Hill is in part indicating that this is something that we owe to each other and not to the state itself. The rationale is that we're trying to protect the conditions that enable others to make choices with respect to their own flourishing and well-being. Okay, that's all for this lecture. I'm super interested to hear what you all thought about the idea of compulsory voting. So I look forward to discussion.